Hey groupers, Pastor Marshall here out here in the prayer garden. We are in Exodus chapter 3, Moses' burning bush, and we've got our own little burning bush out here in the prayer garden, so I thought it would be a good place to shoot. Probably going to hear some car noise, and I'll try to talk over it. I started my message this week with a question, and that is, what do you do when God asks you to do something that you don't want to do? How do you react? How do you respond? What forms of refusal comes out of your mouth when God asks you to do something that you don't want to do? Obviously, that's what we're going to be looking at here in chapter 3, in the beginning of chapter 4, Moses' refusals. First question is that Moses, it says, is out tending his father-in-law's flock. So Moses has become a shepherd. God picks a lot of shepherds. As we turn to the scriptures, Abraham was a shepherd. Jacob was a shepherd. Of course, we know that King David was a shepherd. Jesus called himself the Good Shepherd. God is called a shepherd in Psalm 23. Why do you think that God is always picking shepherds? What is it about being a shepherd that helps prepare someone for taking care of God's people? What are the necessary skills for being a shepherd that are easily going to translate into being the necessary skills for being a shepherd of people? I think you should talk about that a little bit. Next, it says that the Lord appeared in a flame in the bush, but the bush was not burning. I just think as a group, I'd like you to talk for just a few minutes about what do you think that looked like? Come up as a group with some kind of group think on how was there fire in the bush, but the bush was not burning. Is this like a flame? Well, I don't want to give you my ideas. I want you to talk about what do you think that this looked like? Flame in the bush, but the bush is not burning. Now next, in verse 6, actually is quoted by Jesus in Matthew chapter 22, verse 32. Jesus quotes verse 6. I'd like you to turn to Matthew 22, and I'd like you to look at the context. Who is Jesus talking to? What is he talking about? And how does Jesus use verse 6? And how does that tell us what God means in verse 6? What is verse 6 telling us about the nature of God? What is it telling us about our own nature? What is it telling us about eternal life? Look at verse 6. Look at Jesus quoting in verse 6. And what is the teaching principle that verse 6 tells us that's so important in this early part of the book of Exodus? Well, following that, in verse 11, we have Moses' first refusal to God's request. What is Moses' first refusal to God's request? Give it in human terms. And then in verse 13, we have Moses' second refusal to God's request. What is Moses' second refusal to God's request? What is Moses saying? Just give it in layman's terms. Now next, after Moses' second refusal, God gives his name. He says, I am. What does God's name, I am, teach us about the very nature of God? And not only what does it teach us about the very nature of God, what does it teach us about how he is with us when he sends us out on his mission? So he's sending Moses obviously on a mission. What does this title of God, I am, mean for God's messengers, for God's missionaries? Well, then we have Moses' next refusal, his third refusal from God's request. What is Moses' third refusal from God's request? Again, we're trying to put these in human terms. And we have Moses' fourth refusal. What is Moses' fourth refusal from God's request? And again, put that in human terms. What is Moses saying? And then finally, we have Moses' fifth refusal. And his fifth refusal, well, first of all, what is it? Give it in human terms. But then God responds very differently to Moses' fifth refusal. Why do you think that God responds so differently to Moses' fifth refusal? Why does God get angry? Why is he not angry for 1, 2, 3, and 4? And why does he respond in anger when Moses refuses for the fifth time? Is God just worn out after 5 refusals? Or is there more going on here? Well, every week, I want you to think about the application. I told you that Moses' refusals meant that he was being irreverent and he was being irrelevant. That he was being irreverent. He was saying that God is really not capable of all the promises that he says he's capable of. God really is not God. That's irreverent. And he was being irrelevant. He was saying that God really can't help us, that God really won't be with us, that God is irrelevant. And so I wonder about our own times when we refuse to God, how we would be reminded of these two words, irreverent and irrelevant. And just, I challenge you to think about, what is God asking you to do, and how will you step into that now? How will you stop with all the refusals? Well, I hope that you have a wonderful group, and you ought to come out sometime and see our beautiful prayer garden. As spring is springing in Southern California, so are all the amazing plants and flowers that are out here that have been put in by some amazing people in our church. So just walk out here. It's on the end of our property, out north of the brand new building. I hope that you have a great small group, and I look forward to seeing you next week for the next step in the book of Exodus. God bless.